And I'll thank also Professor Martinucci, Cagliari, Giancotti, Ridolfi for quite extraordinary introductions. Obviously, to be celebrated in the context of Piranesi and the Prix de Rome is quite exciting, and I almost would say intimidating. At the same time, when you ask me to compare or to confront the Fun Palace and the idea of museum, I just ask you to see this wonderful space that you have, which I understand was an aquarium and now was meant to be an aquarium, as now is quite an extraordinary exhibition and a sort of celebration or a lecture space. So I just congratulate the Ordine and the Casa the Ordine of Architects of Rome and the Casa dell'Architettura, as well as the thanking the Accademia Adriana for having, invented or discovered a form of event that celebrates architecture at all times of its history. So what I would like to try to do with you this afternoon is not trying to go through all the early work. I think Professor Perasut has done a quite extensive job of going to the early days, where I was asking myself about, before even architecture there's space, and before space there's the body, or the body and the space cannot be separated from one another, and developed a whole series of questions. The word question is important, because as an architect you do not necessarily have something which is fixed, which is frozen, which is, simply part of frozen history. On the contrary, architecture is completely alive, and it's reinvented by every generation. So what I would like to try to show you now is simply a few thoughts that have come out of practice. In other words, theory and practice are very interlinked in architecture. You can't take them apart. Sometimes theory precedes praxis, and sometimes practice precedes theory. They go with one another. The reason is simple, is that architecture is not simply about form or about knowledge of form, but architecture is a form of knowledge. And it's an unusual form of knowledge because it needs also to refer to the built work, in other words, to materiality. So let me show you a few points, and I will of course show the Acropolis Museum, but more in the context of maybe something which is quite important, which is the fact that they are certain. Let me see how this works. Yes, let's try. If you want to get me the first image, perfect, yes. I've called this talk, and it's the first time I give it, so it'll be sort of tentative, is the idea that there are maybe certain things which are site-specific concepts. A concept is supposed to be something very universal, very abstract. For example, just to give you an example, you can start from scratch. You can do a tabula rasa concept. And in this sense, of course, a famous example is Le Corbusier plan for Paris. It's a concept, clearly. It's an abstraction as well. It's one that can be repeated, not only in Paris, but in Shanghai, in Mumbai, and elsewhere. So the point is, architecture is not only about things that can be repeated everywhere. It is also sometimes exactly the opposite. That is a concept which is specific to a site, which is specific, that cannot exist anywhere else. An example that you know very well, the Casa Malaparte. It cannot exist anywhere, it would just be laughable. So that's a concept as well, but it's a site-specific concept. So I'd like to show you a few projects where the concept, in other words, that abstraction, is really born out of the constraints of the site, or the constraints of the problem, or the conditions in which you as an architect are to locate that particular building. The first example I'll show you, I'm not showing them to you chronologically, but more thematically. The first one I will show is called Le Frénois. This was, the request was to design a Bauhaus for the 21st century, an electronic Bauhaus, and a Bauhaus that would work with all the new media. But on the site was an existing building, and that building was supposed to be demolished. And you know, I went to see the site, I looked at the building, it was not particular. Nevertheless, it had some interest, it had some interesting roofs over it. And inside, it had quite extraordinary, very large spaces, a little bit like this one, much taller, much more generous than my budget, the money I had, would allow me to build. So I started to ask, but maybe what if we take this existing building and put a large roof over it, so I can simultaneously save money by keeping part of the building, but also take advantage of some of the characteristics of the site. So by using a concept that was simply conserving, keeping what there was already, but more as a strategy. There was nothing, in a sense, nothing sentimental about it. It was, although it had been built, this was done in the early 90s, at the time when everybody was talking about postmodernism as a sort of contextualism, imitating the past. I've never been terribly interested in imitating the past, but I've been interested in establishing a dialogue with the past. Like on this image, it's really, there's one part that exists and another part which is new, and it's the dialectic or the opposition between the two that makes the building. And in this sense, you could even say that nothing was designed. Everything was simply a strategy to take one existing building, to put a new roof, and in the process, inventing a new type of space. Not a composed space, but a space which is out of a conceptual strategy. So that was, in a sense, the first important example. Another one now, Beijing. Beijing, as you know, has a number of quite interesting, well, I'd rather start with this image. Throughout the city, you had quite extraordinary neighborhoods done with small street, two-story houses, hutons as they were called, neighborhoods which had a quite extensive social life and which were being demolished one after the other and replaced by this type of 25-story towers and with highways in front, completely transforming and demolishing the existing fabric of the city. In this context was an interesting, you couldn't call it a museum, it was actually old factories which had been taken over by artists and art galleries without asking anybody's permission. And they were meant to be all demolished, to be replaced by these, 25-story towers. And in 2003, during a trip there, I started to talk with the people in the gallery and said, maybe we can try to find a way to save the factories and all the art and culture that happens in it. It's called Factory 798, by building over it, by building on top of it. And simply, literally, a little bit like what we will see in a few minutes talking about the Parc de la Villette, having not juxtaposition between different parts, but superimposition. And here the proposal was that one would keep the factories, the old, disused, obsolete factories, treat them almost like archaeological remnants, and above build all the housing, all the, if I remember correctly, it was 1 million square meters of housing. And there we would simply, hovering over it, have two realities, the realities of the past and the reality of the future, the art galleries and the cultural center on the ground in the existing building, and on top, above, hovering all the housing, all the social housing program. So once again, here, this was a site-specific concept. It was a concept that was born out of the site. Third example, the Acropolis Museum in Athens. You all know the context, in other words, the extraordinary Acropolis, and at the foot of the Acropolis, quite extraordinary archaeological remnants. And by the way, this was the site. We said, yeah, that's the site. You have to do something and protect the archaeological digs. At the same time, they also were saying something else. There is, in London, something which is dear to our heart, which are, what the Brits call the Elgin marble, the Greeks call them the Parthenon marbles. It is quite a large chunk of what happened to be, was located inside the Parthenon itself. So challenge, how do you build 300 meters from the Parthenon? Now that's interesting for an architect, right? To say that the most influential building in the history of Western civilization is the one that you have to compete with. The second one, of course, is how do you build without touching archaeological digs? And thirdly, how do you build in order to try to convince the public opinion that the marbles should return to where they belong, in other words, to Athens and to Greece. These three parts were really the starting point of the concept. In other words, a part of the building that would dialogue with the Parthenon, this glass, large glass rectangular volume, then in relationship to the archaeological remnants themselves, to have the building almost hovering but saving the remnants, and then in between where all the archaeological collection of beautiful sculpture would be located. So in other words, again a concept of superimposition of different parts that are directly a result of an analysis of the site itself. In other words, a superimposition of two different logics, and at the same time a direct relation, a visual relation with the Acropolis itself and the Parthenon. It was interesting, just for the little story, during the competition, we were one of the few, or probably the only team that proposed to restore the continuity of the frieze itself, and not to present it as a series of tableaux as they are at the British Museum. In other words, the movement of your body as you walk around is the way you perceive the art. In other words, it's not about something static, it's really about the movement of body in space and its relationship. And then, of course, the rest of of the archaic collection. This is an early drawing, that's a competition drawing. You see their partition, their glass partition. You'll see in a minute how they went away and why they went away. So, a dialogue between different parts, between the statues and the structure, between the archaeological remnants and the new building, and of course the movement of bodies in space. Because museums are fascinating. It's always about a movement in time and a movement in space. So, what happened? So we started to bring it together, covering all the archaeological remnants with gravel in order to protect them, because if you arrive with big trucks over remnants, it's very, very difficult to build. So in order to protect them, we covered all the archaeological ruins with big blankets, with big canvases. Then we poured gravel over it, and then we could start construction. The piles were pre-prepared between the different walls. It was quite fascinating to negotiate with the archaeologists the location of each of those, columns. In the morning, I would walk along the site with the archaeologists, and they say, you can put your structure here, but not there. And in the afternoon, I was meeting with the engineers who said, no, I want the column here because of earthquakes. And the architect was, of course, having to negotiate a possible relation and a possible logic. What was interesting about the building itself is that I wanted the building to be the background of the art, or was in dialogue with the art. I didn't want any sheetrock, i.e., cheap plaster, cardboard walls. I thought the statues had to be in a dialogue with the structure of the building. Hence, the choice of concrete was really important, and the quality of the concrete was really fundamental, and you're going to see that in a few minutes. And amusingly enough, during construction of the building with contemporary technology, the archaeologists were still digging. And by the way, now they're still digging under the new building. And so while we had these big, huge machines, you had the archaeologist with this little brush, and I thought this relation between two different eras, both in terms of the hand, the craft with your hand, or in this juxtaposition, was quite fascinating. And I, of course, who am I to say that, talking here in Rome, where really it is a city of juxtaposition and of superposition as well. So then the reality begins to develop, and that reality, as I said, is again built out of a context. In other words, it is an invention in the sense of invenire, discovering, and making part of the existing as part of the experience of the building itself. Simply having the two of them in a dialogue in such a way that the logic is entirely different, but nevertheless they speak with one another. To the extent that we used glass floors, so that as you would enter the museum, you would be walking, like hovering over the archaeological digs. Kids would look and have fun with it as they would, discover this double reality. And then, as you would enter further, the layering would become really part of the conceptual logic of the building itself. You can notice those little points. The points have a double purpose, or even a triple purpose. The little points is that for people that don't get scared, by transparent glass. Second thing, of course, they don't slip on it. And thirdly, probably it was a theme that went through the whole building. You'll see it in a minute, this theme of these dots. And here you can see some images of the building as you enter it. Now, as you walk through, I mentioned the importance of the materiality, the importance of the concrete. It was very conscious that it was important that the marble of the statues had to reflect the light, while the concrete were to be treated so that it would absorb the light, so that they would engage as well in that dialogue with one another. So that, as I said, the structure, the bones, the skeleton of the building becomes really in a direct relation with the content itself of it. And then you realize, of course, extraordinary things about the details left over of colors because of that contrast with the tough concrete of the building itself. Even the light was another material which was important. In other words, we kept a sort of, not unlike in the Parthenon, you have the central space, but the frieze is all around. And here, bringing light through it from the top, from the sky, down to the archaeological remnants. But always using this interplay between the concrete and the marble. And here, if you see these dots, those dots are here for acoustical reason in order to avoid echoes. And then you walk through the archaic spaces, the columns and the individual statues are like talking with one another, and as soon as you have people walking through it, it becomes quite fascinating, as if the statues were alive and talking with the visitors. And then you arrive on the top floor in that glass enclosure, and you see a few things which are quite fascinating. You have the blocks, the big blocks. Let me see just an example here. Yes, these are the original blocks from the Parthenon, the ones that stays in Athens. But then we had replicas of the one in London. And for your information, you may know that already, is that Lord Elgin, when he took the marbles from Greece, the original marbles are really about 70 centimeters thick and really heavy. So he cut them on the length, and so they would be only this thin. And so we have the replicas. They were given by the British Museum to Greece. And so you see the difference between the block on the left, which has the total thickness, and the one on the right, which is a replica of what is in London. So we use this as a way to articulate the construction. By the way, this man is extremely important in that whole adventure. This is Professor Pandamalis, who is the director and president of the museum and an archaeologist who was absolutely instrumental in making this building possible. And as I often say to students or to colleagues, there are no good architecture without a good client. It certainly was. The frieze is, again, something that you can read and perceive only if you walk around it. It's a sequence, it's dynamic. You just see it almost like you would see a film. It's something that you discover as you walk along. Here, an image where you see through the glass, you see the Parthenon itself, by the way. Or the Parthenon reflects itself on the glass. You see this relation in the section between, it's really at the foot of the Parthenon. Small detail. The glass enclosure at the top is at an angle in relationship to the street level below. I located the rectangle of the glass rectangle exactly in the same orientation as the Parthenon, so that when light would come in, it would come exactly in the same way towards the sculptures. Of course, people, when they saw that, they said, oh no, Bernard Tschumi is a deconstructivist. Not at all. It had nothing to do with deconstruction. It had only to do with the logic of the site. Again, a site-specific concept. And then some of the plans, we won't have time to look in details, but if the building is indeed looks like it's sort of rotating, it's simply because the upper part is parallel to the Parthenon, while the lower part follows the antique street pattern below. See these details. And here, the tripartite organization, the lower part protects the archaeological remnants, the middle part is the archaic sculptures, and the top part is in relation to the Parthenon itself. So that's the section with the very big atrium with the glass floor that allows the light to penetrate, two glass floors, the top one and the lower one, to penetrate down to the archaeological remnants themselves. The entrance itself, the building is recessed from the pedestrian walk. The entrance is marked by this very large canopy that acts a little bit as an umbrella to the open excavation below. And then, of course, the glass floor that reflects, and these double discoveries as you go through. And again, I think you understand the nature of the fact that this building is entirely born out of the circumstances and the conditions of the site, and not at all an abstraction from elsewhere. Little side stories. I heard Professor Perez who talk a little bit about my interest for film and cinema. I discovered something absolutely fascinating during construction. There is a drawing which had an enormous importance for me as a young architect, long before I started to build, when I was really dealing with a narrative of murders in Manhattan and so on. I had discovered a very beautiful, how would you call that, notation for a film by the filmmaker Alexander Nevsky, who had invented a mode of notation where you simultaneously would show the framing of the shots for the film, the music of the musical score, in this case by, I can't remember right now, not Prokofiev, and then the movement of the actors and the movement of the camera and all that. And the juxtaposition of, or the simultaneous information as it would unfold, for the duration of the film, was quite fascinating, I thought, because when I as an architect, when we as architects we do things static. In other words, we do plan, sections, elevations. It's always static. But architecture is not static. You always walk through it. So here in cinema, you had the possibility of inventing a form of notation that was dynamic, that would be in space, but also in time. That drawing was incredibly important for me in the very early years, long before I started to build. Now, the fascinating thing, as I was building the Acropolis Museum, I started to realize one thing, is that the mode of notation, which is shown at the bottom, right, is almost a transposition of what you see above, in other words, the frieze. And I then went to see the film that Alexander Nevsky, that Eisenstein was talking about, had made, and discovered that the cavalcade in the film is based on the cavalcade of the ancient Greek in the Parthenon marbles. So I always thought, and I bring it here a little bit because of, again, in reference to the early work, architecture does not exist alone. Architecture is a form of dialogue between different disciplines. Architecture is a form of knowledge, and in this sense, it's how film and architecture tend to influence one another. Next, Parc de la Villette. Now, Parc de la Villette, you would think, is the ultimate abstraction. Well, there was a site which had old abattoir, in other words, slaughterhouses, which was partly demolished. The idea was to turn it into a park, but it was so large that I felt that perhaps one should look at it like if it was a city and look at different ways to organize cities, concentric or grids or axes, like in Rome, the Baroque axis of Rome, or various other random form of composition, or ordered ones like Hilberseimer, or of course Le Corbusier with the famous plan voisin and the point grid. Then I tried to look at each of these different abstract models and put them on the site. At the moment you put them on the site, they stop being abstract because the site already has a few things in it. It looks abstract when you look at this diagram, but it's not that abstract. It looks abstract when you start to say it's about the superimposition of the lines, the points, and the surfaces. The lines are about movements, the points are about activities, and the surfaces are about appropriation by the public to do anything they want. But it's not so abstract. Look exactly at these red points, how they are adjusted next to the existing building, you know. There's the larger masses are buildings that were already on the site then, the 19th century cast iron building and a big 20th century industrial building. The red points are very carefully calibrated so that they can be a unified element or something that will unify the site, but at the same time which tend to adapt itself to the constraint of the sites. Look at this particular point, that's a cube, but it's broken, it's like in a sort of collision with the with existing building. Or this row of follies, as I call them, are along the canal. It's not an accident, it's really using the abstraction but adjusting it so that both the concept becomes a site-specific concept. Let me show you now, as the last project, you can perhaps try the animation, a project we are working on at the moment. We're not sure, you know, it's like we do, like architects, lots of competition. I'm not sure if I'm going to win this one. I'm one
我们将关注点置于一个对于广州具有重要和神圣意义的建筑。
It's in Guangzhou, in China, and there is that incredible pagoda. And the museum is about the city, the old city of Guangzhou. And so the point, I decided that I would try to establish between the building itself that you see here in the middle of the image, to establish a direct relation with the pagoda itself. In other words, that the building could not exist without the pagoda, but the pagoda then could not exist with the museum. Of course, you walk along it, you get to it, you have, for me, architecture is always about, as I said, a dynamic experience. But this dynamic experience is there to take you again to the purpose, which is the pagoda itself. In other words, establishing now a building which is not a simple object, but where it frames and then relates. This is the cascade which is facing the pagoda in that sort of opening that cut into the museum itself and gets you a sense as you're walking up the different levels. And eventually always turns you back. Well, now it's actually, these images take you through the museum itself. It's a museum about 5,000 years of history of the city of Guangzhou itself, and with all sorts of artifacts of different eras. But each of the openings are always focusing to important moments of the site, including, of course, this incredible, very, very large pagoda, and you see also the Canton Tower there. So in other words, the architecture of the museum is developed as a concept specific, a site-specific concept. By this I mean something that could not be anywhere else. That's the last, I think that's the last phrase. Yeah, I think you can leave that like that. That's fine. Now let's go back to the slides. And so, to finish, I cannot resist showing a very, very different project. A few of you may have seen it, or yeah, after that, no, let's go next to this. Yes, perfect. No, oh, we're missing something. Yes, I want to see this. Yes, perfect. All right, good. Now, those of you who know a little bit a project that some of us are working on, and if I mention key figures in them without going in detail, of course, His Excellency Vincenzo Marini, His Excellency Alfonso Giancogli, and a few other extraordinary people, for a building between Ancona and Pescara, in a place called Grotamare. When we started working on it, we said, maybe I should say that, because I never said that to anybody. Yes, well, I was really interested in cortile and facciata. I thought, I've never designed a facciata in my life. I never liked that, designing facades. But we were quite interested in trying to see how we could develop a cultural center for that town that has probably 4,000 people in the winter and 400,000 people in the summer, to draw an auditorium for 1,500 people and a lot of meeting rooms and a place for music and for exhibitions and for all sorts of things. A sort of fun palace, by the way of sorts. And we looked at different concepts, different possible concepts. I always work by comparison, and then we developed here, we had 3 possible approaches. But I was really interested in trying to explore to which extent we could look at this idea of the facade, the facciata, that idea of the cortile, and turn the building by simply moving very few moves, trying to do something that would work with a couple existing circumstances. It's not about sentimental things. It is totally, in a way, in taking a typology that does not act as a typology. A facade, after all, it's holes in a wall. So we make holes in a wall. But we make them in such a way that it's not quite the way you do them. It filters the light like a facade should do. And it takes you into it in such a way that it becomes an experience. And that the spatial discovery is one that can happen only through movement, space and movement. And here, quite different, if you want, from all the projects that I've shown you so far, but it is also something that in a way, I believe, could not quite exist anywhere else. Thank you very much.